All right, hey everybody. My name's Isaac Vetter. I work on tools and standards that help developers build apps on top of Epic. I'm actually here to talk about the fledgling HL7 FHIRcast specification, which helps developers more tightly integrate their app into an EHR or other clinical system, and is really geared towards specifically full-featured full-featured or other native applications. So first, I want to give you a little bit of background. No doubt you're plenty familiar with Smart on FHIR by this point. I think we had Dan and Josh give a session a few hours ago. There are smart architects. Smart's an HL7 standard, which enables external apps to integrate into a clinician's EHR workflow, among others. It's built on top of OAuth 2 and FHIR, and even enables an app to dynamically share the look and feel of the system, of the application that it's embedded within. The Smart app requests specific OAuth 2 scopes and accesses the FHIR server on behalf of the user. Again, you're already familiar with this. And there are Smart apps running in production today. A Smart app can either be launched from within the EHR or outside of an EHR. And the spec on hl7.org kind of identifies this as an EHR launch or a standalone launch. The important thing with a standalone launch is that the user authenticates. Then with an EHR launch, typically that application is embedded within kind of a container of some kind. So here's an example of this. This is a contrived example of an EHR. So please suspend your disbelief with me and imagine a clinician working within a patient's chart just launched the growth chart app. This is actually the pediatric growth chart app, and Nikolai's in the room, who is one of the authors of this, the author.
I wouldn't claim the full ownership, but I did have my share.
Okay, yeah, Nikolai had a share, and this is for a long time. This application was kind of this seminal Smart on FHIR example, so I thought it appropriate to use here as well. Again, okay, so imagine that the clinician, clicked their growth chart app button inside the EHR, and that launched this Smart on FHIR application and embedded it inside the EHR. The app's authorized, hits the FHIR server, and is rendered. Overall, this works great. So let's dig in to kind of take a closer look. So the way that we kind of see this, and the way that the Smart spec treats this embedded behavior, is that when that clinician launches the Smart app from her existing session, the EHR kind of goes through, generates this launch token thing that we're mostly familiar with, maybe and embeds and navigates to that app URL with that token, and ultimately there's that OAuth handshake, and the app gets back some contextual information. So alongside that access token are some of these other parameters that describe what's happening in the user's session. So maybe there's some additional user identity, maybe there's a JOT and ID token, but noticeably there's this patient identifier, an encounter identifier, as well, and the Smart spec allows other key value pairs to be added there that can also provide additional contextual information. There's also these two things. So this Smart style URL can point to a little JSON object that contains additional styling information that the Smart app should dynamically use in order to better integrate its UI into its container. And then it also includes this need patient banner Boolean value, which, if you note, is not used in this mock-up, in this made-up example. So in this case, this patient banner right here is completely extraneous, right? So my point here is that there's some efforts made to better integrate that UI and that contextual information of the Smart app into its container. And that this works pretty well in cases when that application can be embedded. So I'm going to talk about cases when it can't be embedded, when that application integration kind of is a little bit more, when those applications are a little bit more disparate. So in addition to that kind of embedded web application, two other launch types are really possible. So an app may not be able to be embedded in that iframe for whatever reason. Perhaps it's a more full-featured application. Perhaps it includes a visualization component and needs the additional screen real estate that a second monitor provides. Or perhaps it's even a native app, even including just a Windows desktop application. Or it's even, or we're even talking about multiple devices, right? So maybe I want the session on my phone, on my tablet to resume where I left my desktop. So let's kind of look at those two specific scenarios. So again, our imaginary clinician launches her Smart on FHIR app from the EHR, but it launches into an external executable. So what are the additional needs in this scenario? And there are lots of reasons why this is necessary, why this can be necessary. So that additional screen real estate is just one of them. But if you look at applications that require attaching to local devices, to scanners, to printers, to video cameras, whatever it is, that's a real and legitimate need for native apps in some cases. So as our clinician takes actions in these two different applications that are open and that aren't visually integrated, maybe she closes the current patient in the EHR and opens her next encounter. But that application, that pediatric growth chart application in this case, is still open without being manually navigated. It's still showing the previous patient, and bad things can happen when that's the case. So overall, according to SMART, there's no ongoing communication between the two apps. There's no ongoing synchronization between the two applications. Even very specifically, even in the spec, SMART's an app launch protocol. The app got launched. What more do you guys want? And so the problem is that it's easy for that user to get confused about the application, which application is displaying which patient, and then not to mention, even when that's not the case, just the poor user experience of navigating between different applications, kind of patient pick lists or patient selectors. So same scenario, but different devices. Overall, I think that different devices, different form factors are best for different activities and different workflows. A rounding nurse wants a mobile device. A clinician charting wants that extra screen real estate. Why can't our clinician pick up where she left off on her previous device? So overall, the synchronization of disparate healthcare applications is actually in really wide use in production today. It ranges from special Microsoft COM APIs for apps on the same machine to kind of maybe shell or command line arguments or polling for XML files, kind of direct socket, TCP/IP communication, and web launches. These synchronization specifications typically broadcast workflow events such as patient chart opened, patient chart closed, encounter opened or closed, log in, log out, in order to present a unified context to the user. And again, in production, in practice, applications not only support one or two of these, but maybe sometimes even 3 or 4, right? And all of which kind of hurts interoperability. So FHIRcast provides this modern, simple app context synchronization, which naturally extends SMART for these full-featured and native apps that can't be embedded or that naturally run on different machines. So overall, it's a pretty simple spec. I never know if these diagrams make things look simple, though, right? And so I'm just going to, so there's just kind of a handful of different exchanges. So the app's launched from the EHR, and I'm using the term EHR here, but I mean that generically. and to mean kind of the clinical workflow system, the system that the user is in, that the clinician or clinical user is working within. So the app's launched from that clinical workflow system. The app then calls back and subscribes to a specific user session. The smart server has the ability to verify that callback, that subscription URL, that callback URL. And then some workflow event occurs, and the app is notified of that workflow event. And then at some point later, at the app's discretion, it can kill that subscription and cancel that subscription. So that's the basic flow. It's like those 4 things, right? So, and I'm going to walk through each of those. So again, as part of that standard smart EHR launch that we saw earlier, the app can request a FHIRcast scope. And if granted, following kind of normal OAuth authorization server logic and behavior, if granted, it gets 2 additional smart launch parameters, is what they're called. But it's these simple key value pairs in this JSON body that fall alongside the access token and alongside this other kind of contextual information that's current at the time of launch. So these 2 parameters here are a hub, and a hub is the kind of the session server. It's the thing that can grant subscriptions to a particular user session. That terminology is coming from the web sub W3C specification, after which this spec is partly modeled. And then also just kind of a session identifier. So in the form of a URL, we have a ID that uniquely identifies that current user operating within that EHR on that current machine. And so with those 2 smart launch parameters, with that hub, and the app can turn around and kind of query the hub to create a subscription to that session, right? So we just got a URL that we can ask to create a subscription, and a session identifier that we want to subscribe to. And so again, we modeled this spec after some implementation feedback. Thanks, Jenny. And after the W3C's web sub spec, which is again a pretty simple set of interactions. So essentially, in order to create that subscription, all that the app needs to do is do a simple HTTP post to that hub, to that URL that it just received, with a couple of these, with some of these parameters, the parameters that are listed here. And some of those are a little bit detailed, but essentially just look something like this. So it's URL encoded because it's the body of a post. But essentially, all it contains is the action I want to subscribe, that URI of the user session, so the session identifier, and then some additional information like the list of events that I actually want to hear about. So the hub verifies that URL by in an attempt to ensure that the subscriber that's subscribing actually owns the URL that it just provided. And then some workflow event occurs in that EHR, and that application is notified of that workflow event in a pretty simple JSON message that looks like this, and that uses FHIR as that underlying payload, as that mechanism to describe what's actually happening in the EHR. So FHIR is the data model that defines, whatever it is. Patients encounters imaging studies, or what's in the spec right now, and we can easily see that extended to observations, to procedures, to basic clinical concepts, right, based upon the clinical systems in play. And then lastly, there's kind of just a simple unsubscribe that directly follows, is directly modeled after that subscribe action. That is overall, that is the specification, just kind of in a nutshell, and where we are, and the need. I want to try to, right now stuff's This is still pretty early. We've been kind of prototyping this at Connectathons. We've got FHIRcast.org up is the basic spec. We have a sandbox at our GitHub site you can download and runs in .NET Core, so it's multi-OS. And then we've also got some other kind of clients that we're playing around with. There's a tutorial, a basic tutorial, again on our sandbox GitHub site. All of the spec and the code are all kind of viewable on GitHub. And we've also got a Zulip channel and a Google group. Right now what we're looking to do is kind of continue validating the specification and that it works and that it provides kind of a simple alternative to the proprietary mechanisms that are widely in use in production now. And we're also looking to have a FHIR Connectathon in Baltimore in September. And here's some information about the exercise. So I think that I went fast and didn't take up the time I was allotted, so I'd appreciate what questions, I'd like to ask what questions you have. Yes, please. I don't know about fully, but I think for the use cases in which, for the common use cases, I think, so my personal take, and I work with this in my day job, is that CCal isn't widely used in a lot of these simpler scenarios. And what the goal here is to replace the proprietary mechanisms that are being used widely in production. The question was, is the intent to replace CCal? Yeah, so some of that is set deal with, so are there specific gaps that will remain gaps? Thanks, Reen. Possibly. So CCal's kind of voting, and I'm not an expert in CCal, and I'm sure that John came in and sat down, right? I don't know where he went. And so with CCal, like kind of the vote, I think that perception is that the voting mechanism in CCal, so CCal stands for Clinical Context Object Working Group. It's a direct socket-based context synchronization specification that was developed in, I don't know, early 2000s, something like that. In the 90s, thank you. And that has seen limited production use. I've seen some production use, and a lot of people invested a lot of time and money into it. But we've still seen a prevalence. I personally see a prevalence of simpler and simpler context sync specs. And one of the kind of design goals with FHIRcast is to not require kind of a two-step action like verification process. And so whereas I think in many CCal implementations, when multiple applications are synchronized together, there's a central actor, a context manager, and then one application A will say, I want to open patient 1's chart, and then every connected application must also signal an ability to do the same before application A can open patient 1's chart. So I think that in practice, that model, while attractively democratic, has also led to negative user experience and performance, as well as that an emphasis on centralized context managers, I think has also driven up cost for health systems. And so while nothing about FHIRcast precludes centralized context managers, and no doubt they could provide a lot of value, they aren't obviously a necessary part, and that we're looking at a little bit more of a dictatorial model where the clinical workflow system, there's a driving clinical workflow system because that's primarily how things are done in production. That driving clinical workflow system is opening patient A's chart. That is communicated. The integrated applications can respond through simple HTTP statuses that they're not able to synchronize, and then it's up to that driving application to represent that application B fell out of sync according to the importance of that synchronization within the workflow. So that's a primary difference. And I think that primary difference is worth it in terms of simplicity and hopefully less cost. What do you think? Yeah.
Have you looked at use cases where WebSockets might be?
Yeah, man, great question. Have you looked at use cases where WebSockets might be useful? So we've gotten this feedback, pretty clearly, and even have a GitHub issue. I'd really appreciate your feedback on that GitHub issue. So, github.com/FHIRcast/docs. And I think we've kind of gone back and forth and are trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. REST hooks, WebSub is essentially a formalization of the REST hooks paradigm, like paradigm. The concern is with WebSockets that it'll be really hard to implement in kind of production health system environments. That with modern networking environments in these complex enterprises, that we're going to run into implementation problems with WebSockets. I'm really kind of starting to personally, I haven't really talked to many people about this yet, to lean toward like server sent events as an alternative to WebSockets, and just kind of using that single unidirectional lane channel in order to like publish notifications. And then in cases where the application communicates back, it has to do it just over a new HTTP connection in order to kind of like help alleviate some of that implementation concerns around the use of WebSockets. So maybe we'll get to that point this summer in the spec. I really am I think that what we really need is real implementer feedback and experience with WebSockets in health system environments. So I'm not kidding, we would love that. Great question. Yep.
What's the standardized way to launch an app on a device?
Yeah, I don't think that we have that. So, or let me maybe rephrase that, or it would be the smart standalone launch. So, and the spec describes, this FHIRcast spec describes using the standalone, the Smart on FHIR standalone launch. So let's say you got your EHR on a desktop, you pull out your tablet, you open up the pediatric growth chart. I'm going to continue picking on that. It's configured to hit my EHR's authorization server. I manually authenticate on my tablet, but maybe that's with a fingerprint, into the pediatric growth chart. It requests the FHIRcast scope as part of that OAuth exchange, gets back those 2 smart launch parameters, and then has a session it can subscribe to and can therefore be synchronized. So we had this, argument this morning. So whether or not we require a user to, authenticate, I wouldn't mind improving that as well. And we're looking at it. Like, is there something we could do with back-end services, for example? So there are things like that.
So the assumption is that on that secondary device, that particular person that is also in the EMR session.
Well, that on that second device, the user is known and is authorized to follow somebody's session. So there's the authentication question, right? And then there's the other thing. I think the other thing that you're maybe getting at is.
Because you're thinking of maybe a model as well where physician's on the EMR, but a nurse
is following along.
Is following along.
Yeah. The scenario that we talked about was a classroom scenario. So like maybe 20 students follow a instructor's session. And that is all, and so that's really just, at that point, all you're talking about are authorization rules. What session do you have the authorization to subscribe to? And that would be the only difference, which is kind of neat.
What is the vendor interest in FHIRcast like?
What's the vendor interest in FHIRcast like? I think I'm not sure what to compare it to. I think that we've had some success. So we've had, a number of companies kind of participate in Connectathons thus far. We do have a kind of a core group of intelligent and busy people kind of working together on the spec, and yeah. Are there any vendors in the room interested in FHIRcast? Bam. Yeah.
So what about the scenario
They are
where
near.
a remote app wants to call the EHR and have EHR do a separate remote session?
Yeah, right. So what about the scenario where where an application is driving the EHR, or an application wants to start a session within the EHR? So according to kind of those design guidelines, like there's still one application is the driving session, right? So is the EHR the client in that scenario? If so, like then everything works exactly the same. Our language is just messed up. If not, if the EHR is still the driving scenario but isn't running, right? We've got an issue to describe a scenario where, like, how does a remote application start a session on the driving app? And that's kind of, that would be similar to like supporting a login event, right? Something like that. I think that the tricky part there becomes some of the user authentication, like how do you deal with the single sign-on and stuff like that. But that is something that I think would be reasonably supported, and I know is supported in some of the proprietary mechanisms that are used now. And so it ought not to be that much of an uplift is kind of my hope. Hey, Kevin.
Do you feel for when you think this might be ready to take this to the next step, like for a ballot?
Yeah, so Kevin's question was, when will this be ready to ballot or kind of hit a stable version? So I think that we need to answer the kind of WebSockets SSE question before it's ready. And then I think once that question's answered, then I think that we still ought to like have a Connectathon, a prototype, and test stuff out and gather additional feedback and make sure that we're right. And then whatever the actual like paper process is to bring something to a ballot, I don't know. Easy. Lloyd says it's easy. Yes, that's completely my intent. And so yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I would say like if we're able to kind of work out that WebSockets question, and maybe if we don't solve the backend services thing, then I would say maybe like January would be reasonable. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where like everything mostly makes sense. There's still going to be some kind of details. I mean, it would be like a draft, but that would kind of be my goal. My goal is to try to get stuff relatively stable and provide something that people can build on, because I think that once we have this in place, then we can use these really standard, common, really useful OAuth and FHIR connections to do all kinds of cool things with tighter integration between systems that are synchronized. So, okay, I think that maybe we're at time. Does anybody else know? But I'm really happy to continue answering questions or providing information or being on the spot. All right, thanks guys.